The diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, and they are all three going to enclose the third ventricle. The thalamus is going to make up 80% of the diencephalon, and we can identify the thalamus here. So below the thalamus, that's the location of where the hypothalamus is. The epithalamus, that's what's going to be found right in here. The thalamus is a bilateral nuclei that is going to form the superolateral walls of the third ventricle. Therefore, the hypothalamus, this is going to form the inferolateral walls of the third ventricle. It's below it. The thalamus contains several nuclei that are named for their location, and these nuclei project and receive fibers from the cerebral cortex. We can identify some of those different nuclei here based off of location. The ventral nuclei, the anterior nuclei, and some of the ones that we will discuss a little bit later on. One is the ventral posterolateral nuclei, including the medial and lateral geniculate bodies here. Once again, the definition, when we refer to nuclei, we're referring to a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. Therefore, we have all these different synapses of these different neurons where the cell body is going to be found here. And the axons of the neurons that they are synapsing with are going to travel to other areas of the brain. So for instance, we just discussed the cerebral cortex. So what the thalamus is going to function as, it acts as a relay station for information coming into the cortex. So it's going to sort, edit, and relay this ascending input. So information that is coming up. These impulses are from the hypothalamus, which is going to help regulate emotion and the visceral function. We've already discussed how the limbic system is going to function to regulate emotion. However, the hypothalamus is also going to play a role as well. Impulses from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei, they help to direct the motor cortices. So the cerebellum, it's going to function for our fine motor control, and we've already mentioned the basal nuclei, how it has a role in movement, identifying some of those particular structures. The caudate nucleus, the putamen, as well as the globus pallidus, all are components of the basal nuclei. So the thalamus also has impulses for memory and sensory integration. Overall, what its role is cortical arousal or wakefulness. One of the systems that we will discuss a little bit later on includes the RAS system, the reticular activating system. It mediates learning and memory. We will also take a look at how the limbic system is going to influence our learning and memory, as well as sensation and motor activities. Looking at the hypothalamus, we identified that is below the thalamus, and more specifically, forms the inferolateral walls of the third ventricle. Identifying some of these structures, the mammillary bodies, what they are going to act as olfactory relay stations. We can identify the mammillary bodies are shown here. So these structures are here. The infundibulum, this is a stalk that connects the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is going to play a vital role within the endocrine system to secrete hormones. Some of the functions of the hypothalamus, so it's the main visceral control and regulating center for homeostasis. And the chief homeostasis controls, so for instance, the autonomic nervous system controls pupil size, blood pressure, the rate and force of the heartbeat, including digestive tract motility. It initiates physical responses to emotion. So it's part of the limbic system. The hypothalamus, it also controls endocrine system functions, something that we've mentioned, secretions from the anterior pituitary gland, including the production of some of these posterior pituitary hormones. And the other role are basic functions here. So to eat, sleep, drink, and as well as our body temperature. The hypothalamus is going to help regulate all of these different basic functions here. One structure to make note of is the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the thalamus that's going to help set our biological clock. That is going to be found right over here. The last structure is the epithalamus. So this is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon. It contains that pineal gland that is going to secrete a substance known as melatonin. So that's going to help regulate our sleep and wake cycle. To identify some of these particular structures, we can see this is the thalamus, this part that's here in purple. And the view that you're looking at, this is going to be a ventral view, and this is a dorsal view. So in this dorsal view, this, which is the pineal gland. We've already identified the mammillary bodies shown here on the ventral view. You can also see, so this is the location of where the hypothalamus is going to be found. The brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. If we take a look at the structures of where they're found, from here all the way down here, this is the midbrain. This structure in the front, this is the pons, and then back here, this is where the medulla is. The brainstem is similar in structure to the spinal cord, and it contains nuclei embedded in white matter. It's also associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. It's also going to control autonomic behaviors that are necessary for survival and contain fiber tracts connecting the higher and lower neural centers of the brain. We'll start off with the midbrain. It's located between the diencephalon and the pons, and it contains the cerebral peduncles. So these are two ventral bulges that are going to contain pyramidal motor tracts. When we say pyramidal motor tracts, this is a descending tract. We're sending information to the muscles for muscle contractions. The location of where the cerebral peduncles are found, I'll use this as A. The cerebral peduncles are going to be found right in here. That's the cerebral peduncles. You also have the cerebral aqueduct. We've talked about that. It's where CSF is going to travel, and it connects the third and the fourth ventricles. The CSF traveling through the cerebral aqueduct is right in there. You also have the periaqueductal gray matter, and it's nuclei that's going to play a role in pain suppression, including our fight or flight response. This is associated with the autonomic nervous system. You also have nuclei that are going to control these different cranial nerves, which include cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and then cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. Both of these cranial nerves are going to be associated with movement of the eyes. And we'll see that nuclei are found throughout the brainstem. These two are the ones found for the midbrain. And then within the pons, you have cranial nerve 5, which is the trigeminal, 6, which is the abducens, and then 7, which is the facial. So if you look at the sequence, it's pretty much going in order 3, 4, and then it's 5, 6, 7, and then here at the bottom within the medulla, you've got nuclei for cranial nerve 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. One of the specific ones, the vestibular and cochlear nuclei. So vestibulocochlear cranial nerve, that is cranial nerve number 8. And it's going to mediate responses that maintain equilibrium or our balance. Working our way back up to the midbrain, you've got the corpora quadrimina. The corpora quadrimina, that can be shown right over here. So that's these two structures. So this one and this one. This one at the top, this will be B, and then this is C. So B is the superior colliculi, and then C is the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi is for our visual reflex centers, and inferior colliculi is for auditory relay centers. You also have the substantia nigra, which is found within the midbrain, and it's functionally linked to the basal nuclei. One of the diseases that we briefly talked about or mentioned was Parkinson's. To identify the substantia nigra, that is going to be found right in here. Another structure is the red nucleus. The red nucleus, this is for our descending or motor pathways. And then within the red nucleus, you also have nuclei that are going to be associated with the RAS system, so the reticular activating system, which is responsible for wakefulness. Moving our way down towards the pons. So the pons is composed of these conduction tracts. You've got longitudinal fibers connecting the higher brain centers in the spinal cord, and then the transverse or the dorsal fibers. So this is relaying impulses between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. And then you also have nuclei to help maintain our normal rhythm of breathing. Moving onwards to the medulla. The medulla, it blends in with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. That foramen magnum is that hole at the bottom of the skull where this is going to pass through the medulla. So the medulla oblongata contains the fourth ventricle, and it is a continuation of the central canal of the spinal cord. If we take a look at the medulla oblongata, over here you've got the choroid plexus, as well as you can see the fourth ventricle. The choroid plexus, that's what's going to be responsible to produce our cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF. Some of the structures for the medulla oblongata include the pyramids. We can identify the pyramids here, including the decussation of pyramids. That's where these tracts are going to pass over. And then you also have the olives. So they are swellings caused by underlying inferior olivary nuclei. So these pyramids, they're two ventral longitudinal ridges that are formed by the pyramidal tracts. Where are these pyramidal tracts coming from? The primary motor cortex. We will discuss all about the ascending and descending tracts later on. The decussation of pyramids, this is the point where these pyramidal tracts, they're going to cross over. As we've discussed, the right side of the brain is going to control the limbs on the left side. So these olives, they relay stretch information from muscles and joints to the cerebellum for our fine motor control. And the nucleus cuneatus and gracilis, this is to relay ascending sensory information. This is a component of an ascending tract. Functions of the medulla oblongata. The medulla is an autonomic reflex center. Considering that it's an autonomic reflex center, it's going to have many functions that overlap with the hypothalamus. We discussed how within the hypothalamus, it has large functions within the autonomic nervous system, including helping us to eat, sleep, drink, and regulate our body temp. There are different functional groups of the medulla, which include the cardiovascular center. So this is going to, one of them is the cardiac center, which is going to adjust force and rate of heart contraction. Another is the vasomotor center, which adjusts blood vessel diameter for blood pressure regulation. We also have respiratory centers that will generate our respiratory rhythm, including the control of the rate and depth of our breathing with the pontine centers. Various other centers are going to regulate swallowing, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, and vomiting.